So back in 1981, I used to work for a British architect called John F.C. Turner, who's quite a famous architect in the development planning unit in University College London. And he one day just said to me, do you want to go to Oxford and meet Ian Davis? Because he'd just done a consultancy with Ian Davis in Italy after the earthquake on earthquake reconstruction. So I said, sure. And I really can't remember anything about that day, except at the end of the day, Ian gave me a copy of his book, Shelter After Disaster. And then a few months later, I went back to Peru because I'd already been working in Peru before then. And somehow the book slipped itself into my luggage. And after being back in Peru, I guess a year or a year and a half, there was this guy called Brian Brady from the US Bureau of Mines who developed a complete, it was like a mad scientist, who developed a kind of like a crazy theory of earthquake prediction, but he could predict earthquakes not just down to say where they're going to happen, but where, the day, the hour. I mean, so he had like 3 devastating 9.2 magnitude plus earthquakes followed by tsunamis in Lima in, I think it was July, August, and September 1981, which were going to completely leave the city basically, flattened. It was going to look like a hydrogen bomb had gone off in Lima. So naturally, like nothing happened at all. So his, but then maybe 6 months or a year later, the Japanese government gave money to the Peruvian government to actually do a proper, serious study of earthquake vulnerability and risk in Lima, and then to come up with a sort of what they called a seismic protection plan. And the housing component of that study went to the institute I was working in. That's called the National Institute of Urban Development. And the director of the institute called me into his office one day and said, do you want to be, do you want to join the team? Or I'd like you to join the team doing the study. So I said I knew nothing at all about earthquakes and seismographs and all these awful things. And he said, who cares? I mean, just get on and do it. And if you need any assistance, we'll bring in sort of experts from outside to talk to you about earthquake engineering. So I actually went home and I remember actually searching for Ian Davis's book, Shelter After Disaster. I read it and actually really it got to me because I'd never really thought about the subject before. And it was the first book I'd read that suddenly made me realize that sort of, okay, earthquakes are natural, but vulnerability to earthquakes is not natural. So the way I actually approached that project was really inspired by that book. It's the only book I'd ever read at that point in time. So we actually we focused the whole project in looking at how urban process in terms of like sort of decay of buildings in Lima Center and overcrowding and lack of maintenance were increasing vulnerability. So we just took the sort of the seismicity and the structural thing as a given, and then looked at the whole vulnerability process. So that's how I originally got into it. And then when that project finished, I'd become so enthusiastic about it with 2 friends from the same team, Gilberto Romero and Jose Sato, but we actually created an NGO called PRADIS, the Center for Disaster Prevention Studies, which still exists to this day, and started working in an area near Lima called the Rimac Valley on, same issues, but with looking at floods and landslides and mudslides, and basically advising community organizations and local governments. And that for me, again, was like a huge learning experience. And that's really where I started developing the sort of concepts and ideas I had about community-based disaster management and risk management, which came out, started coming out then and came out more a few years later. But so that's how I got into it, basically in Peru, and basically the person who, in a sense, induced me into it by complete accident was Ian Davis. Because before that, I was just working on urban development and housing issues. I even really knew disasters existed. But over to Allan.
No, Ian also mentioned that to me that that he kind of brought you into it, and that he speaks still highly of your book, and he said it's one of the top 3 books he he actually said he considers us as one of the classics everybody should read. So there's that definitely.
Well, that book is actually an interesting
connection.
story because when I left Paredes, I didn't really have anything to do and I didn't have any money. I went back to the UK, so I started working with John Turner, this architect again, for about a year. But during that year, OXFAM then gave me a grant to write up my sort of experiences in Peru. So I wrote this, what I thought was a book, but then they didn't want to publish it. They just wanted to circulate it as a kind of a photocopy or something. And Ian was actually the person who basically banged the table and said, look, you have to publish this. So that's what I said. Ian kind of became my sort of like manager from that point onwards and really helped. Anyway, over to Allan.
Maybe I'll hand over to Allan now because you probably started a little bit earlier with DRR work, or?
No, I started earlier in life, but not in disaster risk management, like 12 years earlier than Mr. Maskrey. No, I actually got into the topic towards the end of the 1980s. I was working in Costa Rica at an institution called the Central American University Confederation. And I was the coordinator of their interdisciplinary research program, which did work with the 6 Central American countries on social-based issues. I was an urban and regional development specialist. I did my doctorate at the London School of Economics in geography, but with concentrating on urban and regional problems in Latin America. And that was what I was doing when I got into this topic. And the way I got into this topic was purely opportunistic. I was always looking for projects to develop for the Confederation on relevant social-based topics in Central America. And for some reason that I don't remember why, it certainly wasn't inspired by any particular event, I put together a 6-country comparative project on options for disaster prevention in Central America. I just wrote it off the back of my head. I didn't know anything about the topic. I'd never been in the topic. I'd only thought of disasters when they occurred. And I put this together. And as part of putting it together, I actually read Ken Hewitt, who became like my mentor without him knowing it at that time, and Gustavo Wilches-Chaux, who you have met, I'm sure, who I happened to get hold of a copy of his book on global vulnerability, which he published more or less the same year. By just chance occurrences, both of them came into my hands. And I said, well, this sounds like development work more than disasters. And so I put together a project. I sent it off to IDRC and to the Dutch government, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for financing. The ministry wrote saying, very interesting, but we know everything about this topic. Really, we're not going to finance it. That was an interesting comment. And IDRC didn't answer at all. And then a year later, I just put it away in an archive. And a year later, I got a phone call from a guy who would become a very close friend and a very good promoter of La Red in Central America, Luc Mougeot from IDRC in Canada, saying, hey, we just found this project in our archives, which we don't think we ever responded to you. We're now under some pressure to finance disaster work because of the international decade coming up. And Juana, or Joan, had occurred in Nicaragua right at the end in 1988. Are you interested in finance? And I said, well, okay, I guess so. So I landed up with a project in 6 countries, multidisciplinary, without knowing a thing about the topic, and had to put together a team to do the work, which were multidisciplinary teams with lawyers, with sociologists, with economists, etc. And nobody in the region that really knew anything about the topic from a social science perspective. So I put together a team. We had like 300,000 Canadian dollars. It was a lot of money for a 2-year project and really ambitious. And that was basically, I was obliged to take up on the topic, to read more about it, to try and form this team of people. And it was within the framework of that that I finally met people from Andrew's group when I went to a meeting in Chile in 1989. Then I met Andrew in 1991 in a meeting in London. And then we re-met in California in August of 91. And that was where the whole ideas came out of Andrew's head on La Red, and it's building it up. And I found the whole topic so so fascinating that basically the work I've done since then has always been with an urban bent, with a development bent, etc. So from there on out, it just it kept on. And the reason I stayed in the topic is because I saw disaster as the epitome of failed development right from the very beginning. When I started to think about it, I said, no, what this is representing is mismanagement of many things, and it is really the limelight of failed development. So it is an indicator more than a context. It is a context, but it's an indicator of something that's going wrong on many fields in the development field. So that was how I got into it, just by pure chance and some type of imagination or dream. I'm not sure.
Maybe back to Andrew now. I mean, we mentioned already your publication, Disaster Mitigation, a community-based approach. How did that? I mean, you said it was not intentionally to be a formal publication, but in the end, it ended up on many people's bookshelves over time. How did that happen?
Well, I think like the first thing I ever wrote on and published on disasters was actually in 1983, which was an article I wrote with Haghebaert Romero. It was just called "Disasters Aren't Natural." And as I said, that's before Allan was further ahead in terms of reading than we were. The only book I'd ever come across at that point in time was Ian's book. So we were actually approached, this was in the middle of the sort of 1982, 1983 Niño event in Peru. So we were approached by a newspaper editor, Jose Maria Salcedo, who wanted to publish like 3 special articles on disaster risk. And I think it was on Friday, Saturday, Sunday in his newspaper. But he was a left-wing newspaper, so he wanted to come at it really from a sort of social perspective. So I think Haghebaert and I met him in his office on a Tuesday, and this thing had to be, the first article had to be ready for Friday, the second one by Saturday, and the next one by Sunday. So it was a typical one of his things of working literally a whole nighter with lots of coffee and cigarettes, and we got these 3 articles done. I mean, gradually I started writing more stuff in the coming years. I did a paper, which I still think was quite a good one for a conference in Jamaica in Ocho Rios in 1984, which I really pretty summarized most of the things that came out in that OXFAM book. In 85, we published a book on the Lima seismic risk study. And then, so my idea with the OXFAM book at that stage was just, it was almost like a sort of compendium of just really pulling together all these previous kind of articles and things into one place. So I wrote it, and then the English version that came out, OXFAM kind of contracted an editor. So the editor, again, was a bit maddening. I mean, just kind of, to me, kind of randomly chopped the whole thing to pieces. So then I published in Peru, actually, a Spanish version of the same book, which had, I think, 2.5 many pages. So for me, that was kind of a real book, and the sort of the OXFAM book was for sort of a kind of almost like a Reader's Digest summary of what I've been doing. But like, as you say, for some reason, it seemed to hit a chord, because I don't think many people at that time, the whole field was still completely dominated by physical scientists and engineers, the medical profession, and people on the sort of preparedness and response side. So I think what happened with that book, it suddenly hit a chord with a lot of people who had anyway were working with communities on, local development, sustainable agriculture, self-help, housing, and many other subjects. So suddenly, I think, enabled them to kind of connect this very weird subject called disaster mitigation or disaster risk reduction to what they were doing. And it really, I'm still amazed at how many people still read it, because, I go to Asia. This was written, basically, as I said, in Peru, and then you go to Asia or the Pacific and places all over the world, and you find all sorts of people seem to kind of know that book almost better than anything else. So it's certainly, it definitely kind of hit a chord.
Maybe back to Allan now. Your engagement in FLACSO, how did that start? Was that something that was planned for, or was it more a spontaneous idea in a bar somewhere in Costa Rica? Or?
Yeah. Yeah, my whole life has been a spontaneous experience. Nothing has been planned, sort of. So I actually came to Costa Rica from Mexico, where I had a full-time job, and landed up staying in Costa Rica in 1980. I worked in the Confederation for Central American Universities, who had invited me to go for the year up till the end of up to the early 90s. When the institution entered in crisis and had a sort of a boom boom, like in many places in Latin America, there are always crises in institutions. And by good fortune, I got invited to go to FLACSO by who was then the Secretary General, Haghebaert Torres Rivas, one of the best and most well-known and loved social scientists in Latin America, till his death like 4 years ago. And he said to me, please come and work with us. I want you to work with us at FLACSO. And so I crossed over, and at that time, I don't think I really had, no, I think by that time I had a project with Andrew. Yeah, I'd met Andrew in 91, then we formed the LARED in 92. I moved to FLACSO in 92, and we started off with this project on Alto Mayo, earthquakes in tropical regions, basically, which led to a book by LARED. And then I got another financing from IDRC on community-based community vulnerability in cities in Central America. And so I carried on with FLACSO up till recently, with developing a program and attempting to promote research on a Latin American basis, and teaching, etc.
I need to give you a bit of history on LARED. I mean, basically how that happened was, I mean, like from when I first started working on the subject, over the years, I gradually started meeting people from other countries in Latin America, which had similar visions and similar ideas. So I think like Gustavo Wilches, I met in Jamaica in 1984. Omar Dario Cardona and Andres Velasquez, I met in Ecuador, I think probably 1990. Allan and Virginia Garcia, Elizabeth Mancia, we all met in around 1991. And in those kind of the last few, in fact, I mean, by the time the OXFAM book came out, I wasn't even working in disaster risk reduction anymore. I was basically had gone back into housing and urban development. So I mean, for me, it was almost like a sort of a past subject. And then suddenly a couple of things happened. One was in an area where in the Peruvian jungle where I was working on local development planning, there was a big earthquake in an area called the Alto Mayo. So that kind of like, whether I liked it or not, it just like jerked me straight back into the subject. So we put together a housing reconstruction program there. And I started again writing about it. So I suddenly found myself, whether I liked it or not, back into the disaster subject. And then, like as Alan's already mentioned this meeting, I think for me the sort of the key, let's say, thing that pushed me over the brink. I've been over the brink my entire life, but let's say that we both separately got invited to this meeting in Los Angeles to mark the start of the IDNDR. And I really didn't want to go, but in the end I went. But when I went, I thought, well, my God, since I was working in Paredes and since the Oxfam book and all that, I thought the world would have like moved on. And suddenly I was in this big, like, international meeting, and it's like the clocks had stopped, everything was still like physical science, engineering, medical people, Claude de Ville. That's when I don't know why, it was in the weeks following that and having, had drinks with Allan and Virginia and others, I was suddenly thinking, well, yeah, I mean, if the Pan American Health Organization can have their big projects with money to promote their stuff, and the Organization of American States can promote their stuff, and the International Engineering Federation can promote their stuff, we need some kind of like platform to promote our stuff. Because Andrew, with one small organization in Peru, no one's going to take any notice, or Allan with one project in Central America is not going to take any notice. So my kind of idea was, why don't we just like pool efforts? Let's not create an organization, because that's like really complicated. You then need to have offices and bank accounts and lawyers and auditors. Let's just have a kind of a loose network of organizations. So that was what the idea came from. Now, we didn't go through any kind of like selection process. All I did was basically go through my address book and call all these people who seem to have roughly like-minded ideas I've met over the last, 7 or 8 years. And we managed to get some money. I was in London in July 1991 after coming back from Los Angeles. So I just waltzed into what at that time was called the Overseas Development Administration, and asked to talk to the people who, you guys going to do anything for the IDNDR? So I met these two, they look like gray, middle-aged, British bureaucrats in gray suits and gray hair. They look very much like the guy, a character out of Monty Python's, these kind of people who live in the London suburbs and cultivate geraniums and do things like that. King gardeners and chartered accountants. So I said to them, what are you going to do about the IDNDR? They obviously hadn't even thought about it. So I said, well, I've got a great idea. So, we want to do this. And then it was amazing. They said, well, it sounds a great idea. We don't have any ideas, so let's do your idea. So they said, well, we'll give you I can't remember how much it was, 20,000 or 30,000 pounds to hold a couple of meetings and get this thing going. So we suddenly had some money to at least have a meeting. So Allan was temporarily unemployed because he was between CSUCA and FLACSO. So this guy needed some help. So I said to Allan, look, man,
humanitarian help.
Yeah, I said, look, man, I'll give you like 2,000 pounds, and you organize the meeting in Costa Rica. And I said the only condition I put on this is we have it in Limon on the Caribbean coast. So between Allan and I, we kind of organized this whole meeting, which was August 1991, and no one who was coming to the meeting really knew what they were coming for, and we didn't even really know what was going to happen. I mean, it wasn't, we just talked vaguely about having a sort of regional project or program, not a network, but it was one of these things of just pure chemistry combined with the moment, but everything and everyone sort of gelled together. And by the time 3 days later when we left, we'd created La Red. They just seemed to sort of come out of a sort of a hat. And it then actually worked. I mean, because we had this kind of group of people from 7 or 8 countries, we started putting out, publications, starting with the agenda to investigate the research agenda. And I think it was just like it sent a shockwave through the entire region. There's completely different ideas. And it's not just Andrew or not just Allan or not just Omar. It was signed off by a whole range of institutions and people. And it really then just kind of snowballed, and we started getting, more funding. We're able to do more things, more comparative research projects, more seminars. And we seem to be sort of popping up everywhere because we had this quite big group of people. So if anyone looked at the agenda, you'd see any one month was a La Red meeting in Guatemala, something else was happening in Buenos Aires, something else was happening in Mexico, something in Lima. So we probably gave the impression of doing a lot more than we were really doing. And then the other thing which I'll put on the table, because I think it's probably one of his, let's say, implicit things. I mean, it's not something you can really prove, but I actually think made a huge difference was, I mean, maybe I had a bit of a background from the sort of the music business, from the reggae business in London, particularly before then, and dub. So I brought a bit of a kind of, let's say, dub attitude to the whole thing. So we really wanted to break down this kind of how should I say, formality that existed in a lot of these other institutions. You looked at their publications, they were dead boring. I mean, they looked really, I mean, I started, as soon as I looked at the cover, I started falling asleep. And, people with, wearing suits, and generally it was a kind of a level of formality, which for us had nothing to do with the kind of reality on the ground in disaster-prone or risk-prone communities in the region, which was much more vivid, much more, vivential. It was a completely different thing. So the way we started the design of the books, the covers, as I said, they were really kind of dubby, actually. I mean, really sort of completely different to anything that had been out in the region before. Then when we started putting together the first journal, this Disasters and Society journal, the whole graphic design and art became even madder still. So this again, it maybe created an image in the region of a completely mad group of people. It was a kind of almost like a group of anarchists who had suddenly started really sort of taking the thing by storm. And as I said, for whatever reason, whatever chemistry or just serendipity, the whole thing kind of, at least for a few years, really worked. And I mean, I'll let Allan carry on from here.
No, well, it's in that framework that FLACSO, for instance, and ITDG served as a institution. We needed institutional base, and we weren't an institution. And so finally, we were obliged to create ourselves as an institution and get legal status, because a lot of agencies started to say, well, we really do need, but up till that time, which was like 98, something like that, 97, we would finance projects for LARED through FLACSO or through ITDG or through CSUCA or etc. Yeah, and the thing I think, what was interesting, it was only 14 people that were there. They were from a mixed bunch from all types of sciences, not just social science. There was engineers and geologists, etc. They were from academia, from government, and from NGOs. That small group of 14 people, actually, it covered the spectrum of what you needed to come together. And it came together in 2 days. We wrote the agenda, which was a spontaneous thought process which captured the imageries of most people there, but we were all in agreement. We had some tensions the first day, we had to, but then it all flowed together. And from then, under Andrew's leadership out of ITDG, which was, he could dedicate a good part of his time to it, which was useful. We managed to do what I think was a significant contribution, and synthesizing, but expanding and innovating with inputs from people like Ben, from Ken Hewitt, from Ian Davis, from people north of the border, Tony Oliver Smith, etc. But it had another spice in it. There was something which was like chili in it, which even Ben accepts. This was this interchange and innovation as we went along. And it really lasted formally till like 2005. And since then, LARED has been like something in the air, I think. It doesn't exist formally in any big sense nowadays, but it's all over the place. It never goes away.
It sounds a bit like SARS-CoV-2 virus.
Yeah, right. It's like
I mean, at the same time, there were initiatives in Africa, such as Peri Peri and Duryuk Nivaran in South Asia, and I think also Zen doing some work in the Philippines. And I read somewhere that you also try to kind of link those regional networks. When did that happen?
It's like, it was. I had a really good friend in Sri Lanka called Priyanthi Fernando. I mean, we were very close friends. So I was talking to her one day, and we were trying to think of she liked the red, so I said to her, why don't you do something like similar in South Asia? So she thought about it and thought it was a great idea. So then again, she contacted people in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and put together this South Asian network. Again, they had I wasn't actually at their first meeting, but I think that's where they came up with this name, Duryuk Nivaran. And it sort of evolved in a very, very different way to LARED. But again, it was really just from this friendship with her that sort of grew out. Priyanthi is still really, really active now. She runs the sort of Asian network for the protection of women's rights out of Kuala Lumpur, and we still keep very closely in touch. And then a similar thing happened with Peri Peri, was I got to know Elsa Holloway, actually in a meeting in Russia, can you believe? I mean, what a weird place to meet someone outside Moscow. It looked like a kind of a gulag. And we got talking, and again, I was explaining to her how LARED worked and how we'd been able to sort of shake things up a bit in Latin America. And she said, wow, it'd be really great if we could do something like this in Southern Africa. So she managed to get money as well from the Brits to hold a meeting or a few meetings. And I actually came down and helped her organize the first meeting of Peri Peri. So that's how those two things came together. I mean, I also got invited to start giving these courses on community-based disaster management in ADPC with Sunny Jagios and Kamal Kishore. So that sort of opened another connection. That's when I first met Zen, I think, and that's really where thing came from. And I'll just say a few more words and then Allan can carry on. But I mean, we started, I think this is when we really started influencing international policy, because even before the Peri and Duriag thing started, back in 1994, we got invited by Omar Dario, who was the head of the Colombian national system. They were going to host the Inter-American Conference on DRR as the precursor to Yokohama. And Omar was a member of LARED, so he asked us to have a meeting in Cartagena in parallel to the other meetings, and to basically write the conclusions, which I think between Allan and I, we did a few days before. So basically, LARED ended up writing the conclusions of the Inter-American Conference, which, and basically that then went into the Yokohama Declaration, which, so suddenly it was almost like LARED was writing or got a lot of our stuff into the Yokohama Declaration. And then with Duriag and Peri, that gave an even bigger platform, in a sense, between three global South-based networks to, I think, probably get into the next big one, which was what was the one after Yokohama? That was Kobe, no?
Kobe 2005.
Kobe 2005, and the intermediate ones in between, the sort of the declaration of the ISDR and so on and so forth. So that's really when I think a lot of these ideas became mainstream. Not I think because, and this is my own personal point of view, not necessarily because everyone understood them.
Oh, but what was interesting, I think, Bruno, from the perspective of how you get something off the ground and how it influences, was this combination of people that actually created LARED. We had the head of probably the most successful in terms of concept national system in Latin America, Omar Dario Cardona, as head of the Colombian system, which has always been seen to be a leader in thought and concept. But we also had academics of some reputation in the region for different topics, history, myself in urban and regional studies, etc. And then we had NGOs with this other perspective on things. We had people from an analytical data perspective, which in the end combined with philosophy led to Desinventar, which, when we started talking about small and medium disasters in the early 90s, way before it got to be mainstream, the obvious thing was Desinventar. We needed to document things. So it was a combination of different mindset spirits. I was the most academic, probably, along with Virginia Garcia and Elizabeth Mancilla. And then Andrew was well into a more sort of outgoing, but academically in the sense of well conceptually based thought, etc. Omar Dario was more active in promotion of national, etc. And the combination of everything seemed to work well, and it allowed us to read different contexts and understand how to bring those contexts together in promoting something in the future.